Good morning. I wonder if we're having the training. They did announce yesterday that we were going to have the training this morning, right? Or is it Thursday? Anybody know?
I believe it was for today. However, I'm not sure 100%.
Let me send an email to.
Yeah, it was showing today for me, but I'm looking at my email to see if maybe we're on the wrong link or something.
Well, I know she wasn't.
Good
Oh,
morning,
there she is.
Oh, okay. There we are.
Here. How is everybody?
Good morning, Caitlin. Good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for your patience. I'm in our Winter Haven office this morning. Normally I'm at home for these, so got caught downstairs chatting with Lane. All right. So who do we have on today? Surely everybody had time to hop on before me. Okay, so it's a smaller group this morning, which sometimes is nice because it'll give us more time to dive into your questions. But the goal for today is to take a look at just the contract basics again, because we haven't talked about that in a few weeks. So bear with me while I share my screen and we will dive right in. We'll go through contract basics and then we'll save a few minutes at the end to go over whatever questions you guys have. So please do, if you have a question right now, or if something comes to mind while we're going through our info, please do let me know. So can everybody see my screen?
It was up.
It kicked me out. Sorry about that. Okay. So we'll try this again. Can everybody see my screen? Perfect. So we are going to start in Agent Resources like we do so often. And I'm going to pull up the example. So when you're sitting down to write a contract, I want to just quickly remind you guys, of course, I'm here to write it with you as far as the edits, revisions. We want to discuss your specific parameters for your buyer. You always want to have spoken to the listing agent because we want to know as much as we possibly can about the seller's needs and wants, because we're not just writing an offer and saying a prayer it gets accepted. We're going to do our homework to make sure that this is the right house for the buyer and for the buyer's loan, and that we're going to be able to write a strong offer that's going to be worth negotiating, because at the end of the day, the goal is the buyer wants to buy a house and the seller wants to sell. So we want to write it to meet everybody's needs as much as possible. So if you know your seller, you call the listing agent, you say, hey, the showing at such and such property went really well. Thanks for that information you already provided, because hopefully by then you've asked about the roof age, you've asked about the AC age. If any information that isn't readily available, sometimes that conversation is as easy as, hey, what do I need to know about the house? So you give them a heads up. I think my buyer's going to be ready to make an offer. We're discussing the parameters of it. What is the seller hoping for? What are the sellers needing? Is there anything specific they need? For instance, if they say, oh, the seller's going to need post occupancy, or the seller's going to need a long closing, you can prepare your buyer for that. It may not fit your buyer's needs, but at least we're going to be able to keep in mind the contract terms that might help your offer get accepted, because it doesn't always come down to the purchase price. So keep in mind, you have your document examples. We're always going to be using the as-is contract. Sharon, do you have a question?
Yes. So, like you said, like writing an offer that you feel strongly would be accepted. But what if your buyer, because I have a foreclosed property and they are coming in with a low bid, and I spoke with with the agent for the bank, and they said, well, that's pretty low, but you can still submit the offer. So, in that situation, I guess you still have to submit the offer.
Yes. So a lot of times when I'm talking hypotheticals, I am talking about single owners, private owners.
Okay.
But in terms of a bank owned, or even if it's an LLC, a lot of times it does come down to the purchase price. So in that instance with the bank owned, you always want to prepare your buyer. It's going to be a longer closing because a lot of times they work on business days. You won't get responses over the weekend. And the way it works is you submit the offer, they present it to whoever the decision makers are with the bank, and then you get an approved price. So if they come back, just for hypothetical easy numbers, say you're making an offer on a house that's listed for 150 and you offer 100. The bank might come back with that bank approved price of 140. And so that's your counter. And in that instance, you're not going to have as much wiggle room with your buyer. It's basically take it or leave it. You can always push back and tell the listing agent, that's the absolute tops. Can you please verify that they're not willing to take anything else? But with bank owns, they're running numbers to make sure that they are going to at least cover all of the debt involved. So it is a different scenario. So it really typically does come down to price. And of course, keep in mind with bank owned properties too, that they're not going to do any repairs. So if it's a home that's going to need repairs, you want to identify that before you ever get your buyer involved in making an offer. Because if they're not cash and willing to take it as is, it's most likely not going to be a home that will be approved for financing. So it's going to be a big waste of time. So you're going to want to identify those red flags ahead of time, discuss it with your buyer, let them know what to expect, best case scenario, worst case scenario. And then it's up to them if they want to spend the time on the offer, because it could be a week or two before you receive a response back. So again, typically when I'm discussing hypotheticals, it is for the owner.
And that's a good point. You said it could be a week or two, because typically when there's a seller, an offer, it would be like, okay, 3 days and it expires. So with a bank owned property, you probably want to put 2 weeks or a month?
If your buyer's willing to wait that long. So here's the thing. In section 3 of your contract, where it says time for acceptance of offer and counter offers, you date it. If your buyer wants to go ahead and make an offer, but they know that their lease is ending and they're going to need to get something under contract by a certain timeline, you can still date it for 2 days, 3 days, 5 days. Because what it means is, although the bank might not necessarily care about your timeline, it protects your buyer that if the seller does not respond within this date timeline, your buyer's offer is off the table. Now, if the seller comes back with a counter or wants to accept it, your buyer, of course, still can move forward, but they're protected that they're not required to.
Okay.
So you could go ahead and make the offer, and then they could be, you know, planning on wishful, you know, they might say this, I really love this house. I know it may not work out. Let's make the offer and then keep on focusing on other properties that are more realistic. Now, we try not to let our buyers put out a ton of offers because that's a lot of work, right? We want to be writing offers on houses that we think are going to make sense for their loan needs, for their personal needs, offers that are going to work. Because if we are identifying issues before we're ever even under contract that may kill the deal, we don't want to get 3 weeks in and then that issue happen. Well, we anticipated this. We could have avoided this altogether if we advised our buyer that there's a better house or a better scenario for them. So just keep that in mind. With bank owns, date this for what your buyer's comfortable with because it does protect them. That is what this section is for. It's to protect your buyers, that if the seller doesn't respond, the offer's off the table. This is by this deadline. So we'll keep moving forward. I did want to pull up the example. When I sit down, and I have checklists and agent resources, so when we're done going through the contract, I'm going to pull that up as a reminder of when you sit down to work on your offers, pull that checklist up, gives you step by step, so you're not forgetting something, because there's a lot of moving parts in each phase of it. So when I sit down, I pull up the property appraiser website, I verify the seller name, how it's spelled. You want your buyer name to match the pre-approval letter exactly. The lender wants the legal name written a certain way, so all documents are going to have to match that. You will, of course, enter your property descriptions, your tax ID. I like to copy it from property appraisers. It is an MLS. However, things happen. So if I'm pulling it straight from property appraisers, I know it's the most accurate information. Your legal description, I should have that highlighted. That's also required. And so then we're going to go down. This section is referencing the typical appliances that are going to be included. You don't want to put personal property in this section, like a dining room table, because a lender is going to kick that back out because they're not giving a loan on a dining room table. They're giving a loan on the home itself. So just keep in mind, typically what goes here is whatever appliances are listed in MLS. And so you want this in the contract because maybe the seller takes the fridge and when you do the final walkthrough, the fridge is gone and your buyer was expecting it. Well, if it's not in the contract, they don't legally have to leave it, even if it was an MLS. So whatever the seller initially says they're willing to give, put it here. Now, if for some reason your buyer needs a different appliance, you can, of course, request it, but you're going to want to make sure that you're bringing that to the listing agent's attention, that it's going to need to be left. So it's not a problem later during the transaction. So pretty simple. Your purchase price is the total purchase price. This is your deposit. You're going to write out the dollar amount. Typically, it's 1%. Keep in mind, the higher the deposit, the stronger the offer looks, because basically it's saying the buyer's willing to risk this much money. And so the deposit conversation, as you've seen in our checklist of things to discuss prior to writing the offer, usually looks like, okay, so-and-so buyer, this is great. We're going to put your offer together. I have some questions for you. how much of a deposit are you comfortable with? Say the home's a $500,000 house, a $5,000 deposit is typical. Now, if there's different scenarios, there might be multiple offers on the table, or you might be an FHA buyer, and for some reason the seller said they would prefer a conventional buyer. Your buyer may want to increase that deposit to look stronger, to look more serious. So just keep that in mind. At a minimum, it's about 1%. That's what's considered normal. You will go ahead and check these, and then if the listing agent puts, hopefully they've added title information to the bottom remarks towards the end in the MLS. If not, you can ask the listing agent when you're touching base with them about submitting the offer. If they still don't have that contact information, just leave it blank. It's a lot easier for admin. That's considered something clerical that they can add in later. But if you put NA or to be determined, then that's considered a full-blown contract change. So ideally we have it when we're sitting down to write it, but we're not going to let it hold up making our offer. So if you don't have this information up front, leave it blank. Because the seller does pick 9 times out of 10, the seller picks the title company because the seller pays for the title, the owner's title policy, which is a good chunk of change. It's based on a percentage of the purchase price. And so that is an expense that we don't want our buyer to have to cover. So the typical scenario is that the seller picks title, the seller pays for the title policy. Every once in a while, you may come across a buyer who wants, for whatever reason, to use their own title policy and their own title company. And in that case, they would be responsible to pay it. If that, you come across that and you have any questions, let me know. Down below on page 4, line 172, line 174, it specifically indicates. So it's black and white. The seller's going to designate and pay, or the buyer. So just keep that in mind. If the seller doesn't give you a title company, that doesn't mean the buyer gets to pick. You don't want the buyer picking because they don't want to have to pay for it. Leave it blank. So your next line that will always be needed is this line 39 regarding financing. The easiest, you can put a dollar amount here, but I prefer you to put a percentage, and you can look at the pre-approval to find out what exactly that is. So they'll tell you the total amount and they'll tell you what the loan amount is. And then you can do the math to figure out what the difference is for what they are putting down. So you would put, if say they're putting down a 5% down payment, that means they're financing 95%. So on this line, you would put 95%. And then on line 42, it's the balance of all of this. The total purchase price minus that initial deposit minus the financed amount to bring the cash to close out-of-pocket expense. Now, keep in mind that doesn't include your buyer's closing costs. This is the true purchase. What are they paying out-of-pocket? Some buyers are so new to it that they confuse the initial deposit with the down payment. They're two separate things. So keep that in mind when you're discussing making offers. Make sure your buyer understands what each line is. You don't have to go line by line when you're talking to them, but when you say, okay, great, what type of deposit do you want to put down? Do you know what your down payment requirement is? I can look at your pre-approval. If not, have you discussed that with your lender? Because you want to make sure they're aware of how much cash they're going to need. And then I always recommend talking to your lender in this process, or when you first meet a buyer and get their pre-approval, so you have a good understanding of what their financing requirements are. I'm going to do a quick search and pull up a pre-approval for you to see it, because I know some of you haven't gotten to that point yet. Let's see if I can find one easy. Every lender looks a little, here's one. Every lender, their pre-approval letter looks a little different, but it's going to have the basic information. It's going to have the total purchase price that they can go up to. This one is from a private lender, so it looks different. It's just a letter. They indicate funding's not contingent on appraisal. So you do want to pay attention to your specifics. We're going to find one more of a traditional pre-approval. Let's take a look at this one. So this is from Ridgeview Mortgage. If you're not working with a Zillow home loan lender, I definitely recommend Ridgeview. They're wonderful. They're really easy to work with. Andrea is great. She knows her business. She's super attentive and responsive. So that's one thing when you're talking to your buyers. If they come with a lender who, you know, is hard to get in touch with, they're really slow to respond to emails, you can always say, hey, I definitely recommend getting a second opinion. And these folks are super attentive and they want your business. They care about you finding your house. So let's look at the details. Gives you the purchase price, tells you the loan amount. This one is nice because it spells out the amount they're financing, but a lot of them won't. So you would have to do the math. You would divide $116,400 by $120,000, and then you would do the math to figure out what that percentage is of 120. But Ridgeview is great. They make it simple, and you don't have to worry about that. So this is what a standard one looks like. Tells you the loan type. So later, a little further down in the contract, we're going to need that. And then it also tells you the loan term, which 30 years is typical. If for some reason your buyer is using a different type of a loan, we may want to specify that in the financing terms, simply because if financing falls through at those stricter pre-approval terms, then your buyer is safe to cancel due to financing and get their escrow back. But again, it's always really important you understand what their needs are. So this could go on to say it's contingent on the sale of their property. It's contingent on the seller providing a certain percentage credit. So that's very important because it needs to be in the initial contract. So let's see. This is probably another Ridgeview one. Let's see if I can find. So see, just as an example, every lender, their pre-approval letter looks a little different, but you're looking for the basic information. This is what you're going to want to review. So moving back to our contract, you've now filled in the purchase price and the financing amounts. If you ever come across someone wanting to make an additional deposit or to strengthen your offer, you could say, we're going to put $5,000 down, but once we get through a satisfactory inspection period, they're willing to make an additional deposit. And this is where you add that in. This isn't common, but you'll definitely come across this with different deals. So just keep that in mind, that there's always ways you can strengthen your offer without necessarily increasing the purchase price. So moving on, line 45, we discussed time for acceptance of offer. This protects your buyer that your offer is only good for 48 hours or 3 days, however long your buyer's willing to be patient to wait for an offer, or wait for a response, and then their offer is no longer valid. That way they can, if they are in a strict timeline, they can move forward and they're not held to still moving forward on this house. A normal acceptance response time during the week, if you send it over early in the morning on a Tuesday, you could say 24 hours, you can expect a response next day. If it's a Friday or a Saturday, I typically, unless there's a reason we're in a really strict time crunch, would give them 24 hours. Keep in mind business days versus holiday days. Simply, if you're wanting it to not rush your seller, you're wanting to be as easy to work with as possible. But of course, every scenario is going to be a little different. Your buyer may know that they have an open house. We're writing an offer Thursday night. They have an open house this weekend. We want a response on the offer by Friday, because I would want to get this under contract before they leave it open to the potential for more offers, because we don't want to be in a multiple offer scenario. So when you get all of your offer material together and then you send in your agent manager review request, it's telling me specifics, and then there's room for notes. Those are the things we're going to discuss. I do go through and quality check, make sure that you didn't forget a blank, or make sure that everything's filled in properly that is required. But a lot of what we'll discuss is, okay, how are we making sure that this is the strongest offer possible? So I'm not here just to use my red pen and go through and edit it. We're going to talk through the different pain points of your buyer and seller needs. So moving on, the next few pages won't take as long as the first. So of course, this is where your closing date goes. Your contracts work on calendar days. So when you look at your calendar, you're going to count it out 30 days. 30 days is what's typical for your lender. If your buyer has already been underwritten with the lender, there's the potential that they could close sooner, because that's going to save time. And say if everyone's on a really quick timeline, you could discuss that with the lender. You may be able to close in 3 weeks. And that may be the deciding factor between the seller picking your offer with a little lower purchase price or another offer that's higher but needs a longer closing time. So again, it's not just about the final dollar amount. The contract terms can really come into play. But a good rule of thumb is 30 days is standard. Any decent loan officer can get us closed within there. If there's a lot of holidays that are going to fall in, you're going to want to give us a little wiggle room and maybe date it out for 35 to account for lost time. But so keep that in mind. And now if you want, I was mentioning earlier, if you're talking to the listing agent, using the closing date as an example, if the seller's hoping for a 60-day closing because they know they're going to need a lot of time to pack, if your buyer's not on a strict timeline, then them being willing to wait may be the deciding factor. Or your buyer, for whatever reason, may need to go ahead and make that purchase in 30 days, but they're willing to do a post-occupancy. So the closing date discussion can be very, very valuable. So you don't want to miss that opportunity to discuss that with the listing agent. Another scenario would be when you have buyers and sellers who one or the other is purchasing, if the seller's purchasing another property, or if the buyer has a sales contingency that they're needing to sell and then have time to move in. You're going to want to coordinate those dates as well. And you may end up needing to do a pre-occupancy for your buyer. So again, this is an important conversation with the listing agent and with the lender to make sure that they can do what they need to do in the amount of time. So once you are fully executed, the clock starts ticking. So if a couple days to send your new deal in to admin, then that means it's taking a couple days to get it to the lender and they're losing valuable time. So when we remind you guys that things are due within 24 hours, there's definitely a reason for it. So I know in the beginning it's hard to remember all the ins and outs and specifics, but that's why we're here to help guide you through the process. So we're going to move along. I am skipping sections. Caveat, it's very important that as a realtor and a professional, that you learn the contracts that you're drafting, because it is your license on the line. This is why we are getting paid. We're expected to understand these, how they protect our buyer and where issues could arise. And some buyers are going to sign it and not think anything of it. They trust the process, or they've done this, 4 or 5 times buying and selling properties. But you're going to have other buyers who they're nervous, they're first-time home buyers, whatever it might be. They're going to want you to be able to give them that confidence to not read it line by line, to, in a nutshell, be able to summarize the different sections and the important parts. You may get a question about a certain section. Well, it's your responsibility to know it. So just keep that in mind. When I first got my license, it took me 4 or 5 hours probably to write a contract, because as I went through it, I was reading every single section. Now, I didn't have a mentor helping me work through it. So I don't want it to take that long for you, but I say that to remind you that you need to get familiar with it and know the information in it. And if you come across a section that just doesn't make sense because it's written by lawyers and some of it does not make sense in layman's terms, shoot me a text, give me a call, put it in WhatsApp. We can definitely help you figure out how to navigate those conversations with your buyers. So, okay, back to section 7, assignability. This basically means the buyer is the only person who's responsible for this contract. No one else is going to be responsible for this contract. Me as the buyer, I cannot legally give responsibility of the contract to someone else. So as a seller, this is the safest option that they're going to see. Sometimes if your buyer's an LLC and they're not certain if they're going to put it under a certain company name or their personal name, they may assign but not be released from liability. So this would give them the freedom to change the seller name essentially, but it doesn't release them. Basically meaning whoever you assign it to, if they don't move forward with purchasing, you're still responsible for buying it. So this would be the second best option in a seller scenario. And now if I see that this is checked as a listing agent, I'm going to call you, hey, buyer's agent, what's going on there? Because I'm just going to want more information. So as a buyer's agent, the more heads up you can give the listing agent so they can adequately go and discuss your offer with the seller, the easier it's going to be for them to get your offer accepted. So keep that in mind. This is what's standard. If you're needing to do something else, you're going to want to give the listing agent a heads up and confidently explain why they can still have trust in your offer, that the buyer is going to see it through. Now, the least favorite option would be buyer may assign and be released from liability. This is used by a lot of wholesalers who are flipping properties. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but that's basically where someone gets a house under contract. They feel that it's undervalued. They're getting a good price. They're going to turn around and sell it prior to closing to someone else for a higher price, and they make the difference basically. So this is messy. This is riskier. You will come across it, but that is not something that we're involved a lot in, and it usually will kill a deal pretty quickly. So in your financing section, it's real simple. If it's cash, you check cash, no financing contingency. If for some reason they still want to do an appraisal, then you can do an appraisal addendum, and that would be discussed later in, we'll we'll scroll down so you can see what I'm talking about. In section 19, if you're going to add any additional documents to become a part of the contract terms, you would check it right here. A lot of times people are paying cash though because they want to get it for a better price. So they're willing to be pretty easy with their other contract terms. So back to our financing section. So most of our buyers are financed. So you're going to check this because we want the financing terms and contingencies to protect them. For some reason, they can't get the loan that they were pre-approved for. We want them to be able to cancel the contract and get their escrow deposit back. That's one of the only inspection and financing falling through is where they can safely get their escrow back. So we want to make sure that we fill this out properly. So B, that it's contingent on financing. You can let this, you can leave it blank and let it default. You may need to fill something in specifically. If that's what you end up negotiating with the seller may be really strict and say, I want to know that this is done by such and such date. Because sometimes they'll want your financing contingency shorter than your closing time. Basically, we want to know your financing is good to go a week before closing. As far as your buyer's concerned, the more time your lender has, the better. But every case can be a little different. Standard, typical deal, 30 days is plenty of time. And you're not going to be negotiating that element of it. If you do, give me a call and we can make sure that we're protecting your buyer. And then the only other thing I want to make sure in this section you check that we don't let just default is the loan type and then a fixed. Even if they're approved for an adjustable or approved for fixed or adjustable, I want this section to be as safe as possible for your buyer. So if for some reason what their loan parameters are isn't going to be ideal for them, they do have the opportunity to back out. So we're going to move on. All of this is standard verbiage on the financing terms. So basically that the buyer is responsible to be diligent, timely, getting their information done with financing. They can't sit on it and drag their feet. And then it does discuss the loan approval period and how that time frame works. So make sure you're comfortable with that information. Then section 9 is your closing cost details. This section says this is what typically a seller pays. This is what typically a buyer pays. Sometimes you may end up needing the seller to pay towards closing costs or whatever it might be. Something might be different. Typically, it's that this seller is contributing to closing costs. So in other, I just put C section 20 additional terms. And then we will put those specifics where we have more room to write it. Title evidence, we can let default unless the seller's in a hurry and asks for something specific. If so, call me and let me know and we can work it out with your buyer. We scrolled to this section earlier. This is the section that dictates if it's the seller paying for the title owner policy or if it's the buyer. This doesn't apply to us because we're not in Miami. This is the standard survey info. Surveys are handled a little differently. If there isn't one available from your seller, your lender's going to require one. And if there is one from your seller, it has to be at least 2 years old. And your lender doesn't always require one, but they're going to let you know if they do. So a lot of times, title company will schedule this on the buyer's behalf. Your buyer's still responsible for paying for it, but every title company doesn't. especially if you're dealing with a attorney's office that is handling the closing, they will not. So sometimes as the buyer's agent, you'll find yourself ordering a survey. So it's important to always ask the seller, hey, is one available? Because that could save everybody time and money. And if not, that may be something you have to work on. But the terms basically say that it's a buyer expense and it's due 5 days prior to closing. Now, the home warranty section, this isn't used a lot, but it might be a negotiating tool. If your buyer wants one, I rarely put it in here because we don't want to tie your buyer to something that they may change their mind on later. If your buyer's wanting the seller to pay for one, and it may be because you asked the seller to go ahead and fix something and they said no, so your counter might be, okay, well, will they provide a home warranty? Home warranties cover the basic, every home warranty is a little different, but they basically cover the main ticket items: repairing an AC, repairing a hot water heater, if something were to go wrong. So it's a 1-year warranty. They usually start around $450. Sometimes the buyer may ask the seller to pay for one and provide it with the sale. I like to go ahead and check NA if the buyer isn't going to expect that, because again, I want this contract to look as appealing and easy to work with to the seller as possible, so they're more likely to pick it. So that's just something to keep in mind. You can leave it blank. I like to check NA. Now down here, this is important because special assessments can be a confusing situation if they arise. It's not common. Special assessments, you can think of those as fees like the condominium association, the homeowners association, something that it gets paid like a deed restricted, legally required assessment. However, it's not related to associations. It's basically if the public body, being the city or the county, has an assessment. So what's standard and what the contract defaults to, if you forget to check it, is basically the seller's responsible for it up until closing day, then the buyer becomes responsible for it. Now, if the seller's aware of it, they're legally required to make you aware of it. If it comes up during title work, this is going to protect the seller. So most sellers aren't going to sign a contract if B is checked, because that would require that if and when a special assessment is found, they would have to pay it in full, and then it would be paid in full, the buyer would close, and that special assessment would go away. Now, if it were to pop up and that become an option, you may be able to negotiate that with the seller, but 99% of the time, they're not going to agree to that blindly up front. So this is just a safety precaution. There's rarely special assessments. And if there are, the seller's going to notify us ahead of time, just like they do an HOA or a condo association fee. So the next couple sections are about the different disclosures written within the contract. Radon gas is naturally occurring in Florida. FYI to your buyers. Permits, they may or may not be open. Title work does their best to look into it. We're not responsible for obtaining that information, and it's up to the seller to provide the best information that they have to the best of their ability, but they may not have all the information. Someone might have done additions to a home and it not be permitted. So read through this, make sure you're comfortable with it. Same thing with mold. It's naturally occurring in Florida. Flood zones, elevation certificates, those change from time to time. Those are not written in stone. Boundary lines change with the state, with EPA, and so forth. So I'm saying EPA, it's not, with, what's the flood zone entity? Anyway, I'm having a moment. But basically it's saying, hey, if down the road you've bought this house and your flood zone or elevation certificate changes, we're not responsible for that. That happens. The National Flood Insurance Program changes. We don't have any control over that. So again, it's just an FYI to your buyer. And so continuing on, it's more disclosures related to all of that. Lead-based paint is the only thing I'll say about that is if a home is built before 1978, this will be legally required. So cement that in your brain. If it's an older home, this document's going to be needed. But this disclosure is basically saying, hey, lead-based paint is mandatory for a home prior to 1978. Because for a new buyer, they may see that document and it looks scary, but it's basically typically saying the seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint. And that is the truth. Older homes, as long as the paint is painted over and it's not peeling, then there's no fear of lead exposure. But if there is, in an older home, keep in mind with an FHA loan, if there is peeling paint, FHA is going to flag it every time, because for older homes, it means older layers of paint could be exposed. So peeling paint is an FHA red flag item. But that's what we need to know, for getting started, is it's a mandatory document for older homes, and peeling paint is a big no-no for FHA loans. Conventional loans, cash loans, it's a, hey, you're buying it at your own risk. Now, if you're in an older home and there's a lot of peeling paint, you might be doing your buyer a disservice by not bringing it to their attention. However, that's what this document is for. So it protects them and protects you, that you can't be responsible for something later down the road. This section explains if the seller is foreign, there's additional paperwork that has to be signed, because it discusses how their taxes are going to be saved to protect the IRS, to make sure they get their money. And then this discusses the seller disclosure. You've probably heard us reference a seller property disclosure a lot. The seller is legally required to provide something. If they don't know anything about the property, then we have basically a waiver saying they don't know anything about it. If they choose not to provide one, we have a waiver that we have the buyer sign acknowledging that they were not provided that information. So that's a CYA for us. I'm running short on time, so I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. Property inspection, this is important. We always recommend a 10-day window. You may end up negotiating shorter. 7 is doable. Anything less than that can be really tricky. We'll want to beforehand if that's needed for negotiations. And then this goes over more terms of the contract. This section discusses what your title company / escrow agent responsibilities are. Most of the time, escrow agent and title company is the same person. Every once in a while, the escrow agent, meaning whoever's holding that escrow deposit, could be separate from the company doing the title work, but 9 times out of 10, they're the same. Sometimes things get funny if the buyer has money with an attorney already and they want to use those funds as their deposit, for example. But again, if you have questions on that as you come across it with deals, that's what I'm here for. All right, so this is important to understand too. I'm not going to go into it right now because I need to discuss the next sections so we don't go too far over time. Make sure you're familiar with the default and dispute resolutions, what would happen if they were to have an issue. And we're going to scroll on down past all of the terminology. Make sure you understand how the contract time works. We're going to keep going. More definitions, important for you to be familiar with them. Okay, section 19. What's common is B, homeowners association, if the property is in an HOA. If your buyer is using an FHA or a VA loan, then you have to check section E to make that financing rider a part of the contract. If it's older than 1978, you have to check P to make that lead-based paint disclosure a part of the contract. And then over here, you're either going to do FF or GG. So think of section 19 as if there's additional documents that my buyer's purchase is contingent on, then it has to be checked here. And so there's a lot of different scenarios that may come up with different types of deals, but the common ones are HOA, FHA, lead-based paint, and then whatever's related to us being paid. Since I created this example, I've started recommending you guys use the FF rider more frequently, simply because the FF rider allows you to put the commission amount on that, and then you're only having to draft one document for between your side and the seller side regarding commission. If for some reason a commission agreement is used, use the GG because it makes your offer contingent on that commission agreement being executed. I don't want your buyer to go under contract and it not be contingent on you getting paid, and then everyone's moving forward but you, because legally the seller isn't paying you. Excuse me. So we will discuss more in depth about that when we go over buyer broker agreements, because those conversations go hand in hand. But just when you think of section 19, keep in mind that if there's additional documents that have to be a part of the contract, if it's not checked here, it doesn't count. And then an additional 20 is where we put anything extra. I mentioned a couple times, mostly when it comes to if you're asking the seller to contribute towards the buyer's closing costs, you would write that here. I also like you guys to use this on every single deal you write, because it provides additional terms to your deposit time frame. So the contract basically says they have 3 days. Well, sometimes because we don't get to pick the title policy or the title company, they're just not that great. And they may take all of our 3 days to send us the wiring instructions. Well, then your buyer's contractually on the hook because they didn't get it in time. So always put this in. It says escrow will be paid within 3 days of receiving wiring instructions, just to give them that extra time so we're not, inadvertently outside of our contract terms. Note, no offer is truly valid without all signatures and initials and without money being put into an escrow account. In Florida, there has to be a dollar amount to make a contract valid. So that's why making sure that gets paid within our initial window is important. And it tells the seller, okay, they're on top of things, they're eager, they're going to make this happen, versus if a seller sees the buyer doesn't even make escrow, they may not want to risk having their house off the market for a few more weeks with a buyer who doesn't seem that committed. So this is example verbiage. You can reference back when you have seller concessions needed. If there's any other specific scenarios that you come across, you and I can we can write it, we can draft it together. Agents who have, done their first few deals with me and they may be 10 deals in and they come across something that they haven't seen yet, it can be as simple as they shoot me a text and say, hey, how do I write this in the contract? And I can quickly send them back what to write. Or it may be that we need to discuss how that's going to work and how to not only write it in the contract, but how to present it to your buyer to make sure they understand what's happening, and how to discuss it with the listing agent side to make sure everybody is understanding it and communicating it, and that what we're putting in the contract reflects what was just negotiated. And then on the flip side too, you're going to come across scenarios where the lenders will be picky. So you might send me a contract and I'll say, hey, this needs to be on an addendum or a separate document, because the lender's not going to accept that. So just keep in mind that there's lots of moving parts, and that's, again, what we're here for. So the more you participate in our weekly conversations and trainings, and then reach out to us before you have a problem, the easier it will be to identify the issues and be able to help you prevent a big blow up. And of course, things happen. So there's a lot of different ways to handle different deals. So it's all about negotiating and making sure you're communicating well with your listing agent and the lender to make sure we're covering all options. I know I got long-winded on the contract, but I wanted you to make sure you saw the important parts. So when you get ready to discuss writing an offer with your buyer, you're comfortable with it. Now, that steps and checklists I was just talking about in the beginning of our meeting, if you go to Agent Resources, then Working with Buyers, your Buyer Agent Steps folder has a lot of helpful information to help you steps from scheduling the showing all the way through to writing the offer, all the way through to closing. I'm scrolling through this fast. You probably can't see any of it, but definitely go back later and pull this up, please. But then also, one thing, I end up linking instructions to different instructions because I want to make sure you can always find it depending on where you ended up in the resources. This has the link directly to, once you're in the offer process, to request that meeting with me and that review with me. But we're going to get out of the buyer agent steps and go back to Working with Buyers. You have a buyer agent home showing checklist. Take a look at that. But then the how-to offers and contracts. What to know before you write the contract. This is going to help you navigate that conversation with your buyer. Early in my career, I'd show some houses. They'd say, okay, I want to make an offer. We'd get real excited. I'd say, okay, I'll get back to my computer. And then I realized, oh crap, I don't know when their closing date needs to be. I don't know what their down payment is, whatever it might be. So this document helps you make sure you're obtaining all of the information you need, because it's a lot easier to get that when you're face-to-face with them, or when you're having that initial I want to make an offer conversation, versus spending the next 2 days while they're at work texting and emailing or starting to draft it and having to stop every time you get to a new section and having to go ask another question. So this is going to prevent you from that headache. It gives you the information you're going to need to know, things you've already looked into from your earlier conversations with the listing agent and the lender. Because again, it's not just about purchase price. How many days has it been on the market? Are there multiple offers? What's the commission the seller is offering? All of that is going to come into be very important as you're putting together your offer. And then as you scroll through, I have examples of how to have those conversations. So basically talking points to use when you're discussing it with your buyers, and then what to keep in mind when you're having that conversation. So I try to make it as easy as possible. There's a lot of references in here. I know when you're out with a buyer, you're not going to say, oh, wait a minute, Caitlin has a handout on this. So that's why I always want you guys to get familiar with agent resources before you're in the scenario for this, and it lets you know what to keep in mind. So once you get thrown into that scenario, you can be a lot more comfortable navigating that conversation with your buyer. And of course, if they ask you something you're not sure of, you can say, let me get with my team, or, let me get with, depending on what the question is, but you can say confidently, let me check on that and I'll get back to you this afternoon. And you can go give me a call and we can work it out. Usually it's something pretty easily answered. It's just getting comfortable knowing how to navigate the conversation. So I know I was long-winded today. What questions do you guys have? Man, the last couple meetings, y'all have been quiet. Normally we have all sorts of questions. So either I did a wonderful job and you're fully confident in how to write a contract, or you have no idea what I was talking about, which makes me nervous when we're quiet. So somebody tell me something, please.
You did a wonderful job.
All right. Well, if you guys have questions offline, I'm available. Text, call me. If you call and you don't get me, it most likely means I'm on a call with someone, but shoot me a text, because sometimes I can answer your quick question via text faster than I can get back to calling you. But of course, if it is something that you're needing more detailed responses on, by all means, just shoot me a text and say, hey, Caitlin, please call me when you can. And I'll usually say, okay, I can give you a call in 15 minutes, or it might be 2 hours. If it's an emergency, say that. Just let me know. We want you guys to feel supported as you're out there working. And of course, I know some of you are still in that early lead generation phase, but you're going to get to this phase very quickly, and I want you to feel prepared. So bookmark your agent resources. A lot of what we talked about today is going to help you in building your buyer relationships, because you're going to be able to offer them insight as to, this is what the process looks like. And that's going to go a long way in helping build those relationships, because a lot of times they've never done this. They don't know what to expect. And if you can help put their mind at ease, they're going to really appreciate you. So I'll give one more opportunity for questions. And if we don't have any, we will end the day. And I hope to hear from you all soon. All right. Take care. Have a good afternoon.